They told him to map the land. But what Caleb Tanner walked into wasn't just terrain. It was a trap, set by the wind, the mountains, and a woman he'd never met. One glance, one forbidden moment. And suddenly, the price of survival wasn't in bullets or blood, it was marriage, and the only way out was in. The sun had teeth that day, biting down hard on Caleb Tanner's back as he rode deeper into the land folks called the High Lonesome. No name on a map. No law but what the Apache set by firelight. Just sky, rock, and a silence that made a man feel real small. He wasn't lost, not yet. But he was getting there. The army had handed him a blank map and said, "Fill it in." So Caleb did what scouts do, followed dry creeks, watched the bird patterns, listened to wind that whispered of places men weren't welcome. He rode light. One rifle, one canteen, one horse named Dusty who knew how to keep quiet. He also carried something less visible, the feeling that this land didn't want to be known, and he respected that. You couldn't outdraw the desert, couldn't outsmart the Apache. The best a man like Caleb could do was move soft, eyes open, and pray the land let him pass. By his second day out, the terrain changed. The sun-baked stone gave way to pine-soaked timber. The air cooled, heavy with resin and river mist. Caleb dismounted, leading Dusty toward the sound of water. There, he found it. A narrow, twisting river, half hidden by trees thick as secrets. The kind of place no cavalry boots had stomped. The kind of place maps forget on purpose. He crouched near the water, filling his canteen, his rifle resting nearby. It was peaceful. Too peaceful. Then, like a breath caught in the throat of the world, movement. Caleb froze. He saw her before she saw him. She stepped out from the trees like she'd been carved from the earth itself. Barefoot, bronze-skinned. Her long black hair clung to her back, still wet from the river. In her arms, a bundle of wild herbs. But it wasn't the plants that stopped Caleb cold. It was her. She moved like wind moves over water. Quiet. Powerful. Unbothered. He should have looked away. He didn't. A twig snapped underfoot. Her head snapped toward him. Eyes met. And the earth might as well have opened up right then and there. She didn't scream. Didn't run. Instead, her voice cracked through the stillness like a whip. "Who are you?" Caleb stood, hands up, heart pounding like a war drum. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was here." She took a step forward, eyes sharp enough to cut hide. "You saw me?" He swallowed hard. "It was an accident, I swear. I meant no offense." But offense didn't care about intent, and neither did she. "You saw me undressed," she said, flat and unblinking. "By the law of my people, you've dishonored me." Caleb felt the heat crawl up his neck. "I'll leave, right now. No one has to know." "There's no hiding this," she cut in. "Our laws are clear. One path remains." He waited for her to say it. Part of him already knew. "You must take me as your husband." The words didn't come with anger. They came with finality, like a sentence handed down from the mountain itself. Caleb blinked. "What?" "Marry me, or we both face punishment." He looked at her. Really looked. The pride. The fire. The way she didn't flinch under the weight of her own words. This wasn't a threat. It was a covenant. And it didn't matter how little sense it made. Not out here. Caleb Tanner was a scout, a reader of trails, a man who'd slept beside wolves and outrun ambushes. But this was different. This was a line he hadn't meant to cross. Now he had to decide which side to stand on. The woman turned and walked back into the woods, not waiting for his answer. And like a damn fool, He followed. Call to action. Ket Thuk Fan 1. One glance, one mistake, one decision that will bind Caleb to a world he barely understands. Will he survive the path ahead? Or will the Apache trials break him first? Subscribe now to follow the next chapter of Caleb and Teva's unforgettable journey through love, law, and the land itself. The trail back through the timber was quiet. Too quiet. Not a bird call, not a rustle, just Caleb's boots crunching pine needles behind Teva's silent steps, like following a ghost into the trees. She hadn't said a word since declaring their fate. Her stride was steady, chin high, as if this kind of thing, dragging a white scout to meet her elders for marriage, was just another Tuesday. Caleb wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the madness of the moment or the calm in her bones. His mouth had gone dry somewhere between the riverbank and now, and every part of him itched to speak, to ask what the hell he'd just agreed to. But something about the way she carried herself, proud, composed, fierce, shut him right up. She didn't look like a woman who welcomed second-guessing. So he walked, through thick pine and spears of sun cutting through the branches. Dusty followed without a sound. Even the horse seemed to know better than to protest. Caleb couldn't stop thinking about the look in her eyes. Not fear, not anger, something older, like judgment passed down from generations. Like the river itself had whispered her rights into her ears, and she was just delivering the verdict. They crested a low ridge, and that's when he saw it. Her village. Tucked in a clearing, ringed by the timber, it wasn't large, but it breathed. Smoke lifted from 2 fires. Children darted between homes built from earth and wood. Horses grazed on the far end. And everywhere, eyes, dozens of them, watching him. He could feel the weight of their stares, like walking into a room with your boots caked in something foul. He was the outsider, the intruder, the man who saw what he shouldn't have. Teva didn't flinch. She walked straight into the village like she was dragging justice behind her. Caleb kept his shoulders square, but inside, his guts twisted like barbed wire. The people didn't speak, didn't move, just stared. He was a scout, trained to read landscapes, bodies, danger. What he read in their eyes was simple, not welcome. They approached a wide circle of seated elders, men and women whose faces looked carved from the same stone as the canyons. Their eyes were sharp, their silence louder than gunfire. Teva stopped at the edge of the fire. Caleb followed, every step heavier than the last. Finally, one of the elders spoke. A woman. Weathered, eyes deep like river hollows. "Teva," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "What is this you bring before the fire?" Teva turned, her voice calm but full of steel. "A man who saw what he should not have. A man who must take me as his wife." A murmur passed through the circle like a rattlesnake sliding through dry brush. Caleb swallowed hard, feeling their eyes burrow into him. "He agreed," Teva added. "By our law, the path is clear." The elder woman, Nizoni, studied Caleb long and deep. A man may speak words, but a heart does not follow easily. Caleb met her gaze. "I'm not here to disrespect your ways. I meant no harm. I swear on my life." Another elder, broad-shouldered, voice like distant thunder, leaned forward. "What you meant does not change what you've done." That was Taza. Caleb had heard the name whispered once around a frontier campfire, a man whose word carried the weight of the mountain. "You come here like a shadow. You see our daughter when you should have stayed unseen. That cannot be undone, but it can be answered." Caleb tensed. "How?" Nijoni's gaze was as cold as spring snowmelt. "You say you will take her. Fine. But words are wind. If you wish to stand beside Tiva, you must prove your heart. Taza added, You will face 3 trials. Not of strength alone, but of spirit, of humility, of belonging. Pass them, and you earn your place. And if I don't, then you leave this land and never return. Caleb looked at Tiva. She hadn't moved. Hadn't blinked. He nodded. All right, I'll do it. The elders said nothing. The council broke like a storm drifting off. No farewells, no welcomes, just the promise of trials. As the last elder disappeared into the shadows, Caleb and Tiva stood alone beside the fire. He turned to her, voice low. Do you believe I can do this? Tiva looked at him. Not soft, not cruel, just honest. If you don't, the land will strip you bare, and the people will finish what the land begins. The fire from the council had long since died down, but the weight of their judgment clung to Caleb's skin like trail dust. He lay on a bed of woven hides inside the small shelter Tiva had brought him to, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind twisted in circles, replaying that moment by the river over and over. One misstep, one glance, and now everything had changed. The air in the lodge was thick with smoke and silence. Outside, the village breathed. Dogs barked low. A baby cried somewhere in the dark. The wind rustled the pine branches like a whisper through church pews. He wasn't tied up, wasn't under guard, but he may as well have been. He was a man on trial, and the jury had already seen his crime. At dawn, Tiva returned. She didn't knock. She didn't ask. She just stepped inside, her presence sharper than a blade, eyes unreadable. We speak now, she said simply. Caleb sat up. All right. Tiva didn't sit. She stood, arms crossed, back straight as a rifle barrel. You think you understand what happened? He looked up at her. I don't know that I do. You think this is about a woman being seen without her dress, she continued, her voice low but firm. But it's more than that. It's about trust, about boundaries you didn't even know existed, about honor, mine and my people's. Caleb swallowed, his throat dry. I didn't mean to violate anything sacred. I swear on my mother's grave. Tiva's eyes flashed. Intent doesn't clean the wound. You broke something, Caleb, and now you wear that break on your back like a pack you can't put down. He nodded slowly, shame rooting in his chest. I've walked with tribes before. I've followed tracks, learned signs, traded clean for firewood. But I never knew this kind of law. I thought I was just passing through. You weren't, she said. Not anymore. Silence settled between them, thick and full of everything unsaid. Caleb looked away first, eyes fixed on the wall. And this marriage, it's real to you? It's not about romance, Tiva answered plainly. It's about rebalancing what was thrown off. Our laws weren't made to make sense to the army or to white men. They were carved by hardship, tested by time. If I walk back to the elders and say I changed my mind, that I forgive you, I dishonor myself. They would punish me more than you. Caleb closed his eyes for a beat. So, I'm your sentence. She tilted her head. No, you're my choice. But don't mistake that for weakness. There it was again. That fire in her voice, that steady, unmoving pride. Caleb had seen hardened men go soft in the desert, watched soldiers break when they ran out of bullets or whiskey. But Tiva? She stood there like the land itself, scarred, beautiful, and unbending. He rubbed his face with both hands. What happens now? Tiva answered without hesitation. You face the trials. First one's tomorrow. Mangas will explain. And if I fail? You'll leave. shamed, alone, and you'll carry that shame like a wound that never scabs over." She turned towards the doorway, the faint light of morning casting her in gold. But before she stepped out, she paused. "I don't hate you, Caleb," she said, almost too soft to hear. "But I won't protect you either." Then she was gone, and Caleb was left in the quiet, the echo of her words rattling around in the hollow place just behind his ribs. He stepped outside a few moments later. The village was waking up, smoke rising from early cook fires, dogs stretching, women tending to morning duties. No one spoke to him, but every eye watched. He was no longer a ghost. He was a marked man. By midday, Mangus found him. The elder's shoulders were wide as a canyon wall, and his voice held the weight of thunder. "The first trial begins at sunrise. Bring nothing but what we give you." Caleb nodded, jaw tight. "This land you walk into," Mangus said, "doesn't care what rank you held, what language you speak, or how many trails you've mapped. It'll take a piece of you if it lets you come back." And just like that, he turned and walked off, leaving Caleb alone beneath the weight of everything he didn't yet understand. As night fell again, Caleb sat by a small fire, eyes fixed on the stars above. He thought of the river, the glance, the law, and the woman. Tiva. He hadn't meant to trespass. But now he was deep in a world where meaning didn't matter. Only action did. And come morning, his would be tested. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the cold was already lifting off the dirt like steam off a branding iron. Caleb stood at the edge of the village, boots laced, skin dry and cracked, eyes red from a night without sleep. Tiva stood beside him, silent as ever. She hadn't said a word when she handed him the small leather satchel. A water skin, a strip of dried venison, a flint shard. No rifle, no compass, no horse, no map, just the land, just himself. From the shadows, Mangus stepped forward, towering and broad, the kind of man the wind seemed to move around. He looked Caleb up and down, not with contempt, but calculation, like a hunter sizing up a deer before deciding whether it was worth the arrow. "You go now," Mangus said. 3 suns, 3 nights, no fire, no shelter, no trail. If you return, we speak again. If not, then the land made its choice." Caleb met his eyes. "And if I don't come back?" Mangus didn't blink. "Then you were never meant to stay." Beside him, Tiva didn't move, didn't soften. Caleb looked at her, hoping for something, anything, a flicker of doubt, a trace of concern. But she was a stone. He gave her a single nod. Not goodbye, just acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked into the desert. No farewell, no trail. Just the sound of his boots crunching dry soil and the weight of eyes behind him that didn't expect he'd return. The first few hours were easy. Caleb had been through Badlands before. Hell, he'd spent weeks alone during the war, scouting ridge lines and enemy camps. But this was something different. This land didn't want to be watched. It wanted to watch you back. By noon, the sun had risen like a noose tightening around his neck. The heat bore down with a malice, and the water he'd brought seemed to vanish between sips. The air was dry, thinner than what he was used to. The world shimmered with mirages and heat haze, and every step felt like dragging his own shadow uphill. He kept walking, because stopping meant the land had won. That first night, the cold bit harder than the heat had. The wind howled across the flats, slapping at his face, his arms, his legs, like it was trying to peel him open. He found shelter beneath an overhang of stone and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come. Instead came the dreams, jagged, half-formed things. Tiva's eyes, the council fire, The shame, the silence. His own mother's face, years ago, warning him, "The land don't forgive, Caleb. You either listen to it or get buried under it." He rose the next morning before dawn, mouth dry as sandpaper, joints stiff. Day 2 was worse. The thirst clawed at his throat like broken glass. His boots wore blisters into his heels. His tongue swelled in his mouth. The sun stopped being light and became a weapon, smashing down from above, reflecting off stone, sneaking into the folds of his shirt. By late afternoon, he stumbled. Hard. Knee to rock, palm to cactus, blood welled and dried fast in the heat. He lay there, cheek pressed to the burning stone, eyes closed. He could stop. Let it end. Let the desert claim him and be done. But in the back of his skull, something sparked. A memory, not of Tiva, not of the elders, not of duty, of respect. Of the first time he ever saw the Rockies as a boy, towering and unforgiving. Of the old Lakota man who taught him how to read wind and silence. Of the promise he made the night he agreed to the marriage. Caleb pushed up from the dirt, legs shaking. He kept walking. By the third morning, he had become a different man. Blistered. Hollow. Sunburnt. But not broken. He reached the edge of the canyon as the sun cracked over the horizon, painting the world in gold and blood. He paused, took one last sip from the water skin, empty, and turned toward the village. When Caleb stumbled back into camp that evening, the village was waiting. They said nothing. They just watched. Tiva stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, unreadable, as always. Mangas stepped forward. "Did you learn what the land teaches?" he asked. Caleb's lips were cracked, voice hoarse but steady. "I learned. It don't care if you live or die, only if you listen." Mangas studied him, then nodded once. "You passed." The others didn't cheer. They just moved aside, letting him pass, back into the place he wasn't sure he deserved. Tiva said nothing. But as he passed her, she looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time, her eyes didn't hold judgment. They held recognition. The desert had taken his sweat, his skin, maybe even a piece of his soul, but it hadn't taken his will. Caleb Tanner walked back into the village with the gait of a man who'd been broken and rebuilt by heat and silence. The people didn't cheer. They didn't smile. But they watched. And that, out here, meant everything. He didn't know what he expected when he crossed that invisible line back into their world. Maybe a nod, a word, a meal. But what he got was nothing. Not from the women pulling water, not from the children chasing chickens across the dust. They kept their distance. Quiet. Measured. Tiva was waiting near the cooking fire. Not close, not far. Just where she could see him. Caleb met her gaze. No smile. But she didn't look away either. And that was more than he'd earned yesterday. Before he could speak, the deep voice of Mangas rose behind him like thunder rolling in slow and low. "The council is ready." Caleb followed. No time for rest, no food, no questions. Just forward. They walked to the center of the village where the fire ring burned low, its coals whispering smoke into the blue sky. The elders sat in a wide half-circle, men and women alike, wrapped in woven robes, some with feathers in their braids, others with lines on their faces that looked like maps of pain and time. No one needed to tell him who led this council. The power radiated from them like heat from a forge. Mangas stood off to the side, arms crossed. Beside him, Taza, who'd barely spoken before, watched with flinty eyes. Then there was Nijoni, the elder woman whose face looked like it had been carved from canyon rock. Her gaze was steady and sharp, full of wisdom and suspicion in equal measure. Caleb stood in front of them, hat in hand, throat dry. No one told him to speak, so he didn't. He waited. It was Nijoni who broke the silence. "You survived the first trial," she said, voice like creaking timber. "I did. You walked our land with no compass, no map, no protection. You faced the spirits of heat and thirst." "I did. You come back different." "I am." She nodded, slow. "We will see." She turned to the others. A low murmur passed between them. Short words in Apache. Nothing Caleb understood. But he didn't need to. He could feel the weight of what they were saying. Not just about the trial. About him. Then Taza spoke, his voice deep and gravelly. "You think you've earned her?" Caleb looked him in the eye. "I think I've started to understand what it means not to earn a woman, but to earn her trust. And I've got a long way to go." That answer hung in the air like smoke. And for the first time, Taza's mouth twitched, just barely, into something close to respect. "You've walked the land," said Nizoni. "Now you will walk among us." A beat passed. Then she raised her hand, and the verdict dropped like a stone in a still pond. The second trial begins at sunrise. Caleb blinked. "Tomorrow?" Manga stepped forward. 2 days. You live as we live. You eat as we eat. You work." Caleb nodded slowly. "What kind of work?" "Not survival," Manga said. "Service. Haul wood. Fix what's broken. Watch the children. Listen to the old. Carry the weight that no one notices until it's gone." "And if I don't do it right," Nijoni spoke again, "then you prove this marriage is not for us, not for her, but for you. And that's not a reason worth staying." Caleb looked around the circle. These weren't people looking for heroics. They weren't testing his strength anymore. They were testing his character. "Then I'll work," he said. "I'll learn." Nijoni leaned forward, eyes narrowing just a touch. "We will see." The meeting ended as abruptly as it had begun. The elders stood and dispersed like shadows into the village. Only Tiva remained behind, still silent, still unreadable. Caleb approached her slowly. "I'm still standing." She nodded. "Barely." That earned a smirk from him. "You ever gonna smile?" Tiva didn't answer right away, but her voice softened just a little. "Maybe. When you stop acting like everything here is about you." He let out a dry chuckle. "Fair enough." She turned and walked away, but her pace was slower now, not waiting for him, but not walking ahead either. And Caleb followed, knowing the next 2 days would ask more of him than the desert ever did. Because now, the land had judged him. Next came the people. The sun rose on the second trial without ceremony. No drums, no fire circle, no warriors watching from the shadows. Just a man with blistered hands and a promise on his back. Caleb Tanner rolled out of the bedroll they'd lent him and walked into the morning chill. His legs were still sore from the desert. His lips cracked. But his mind was sharper now, calmer. He wasn't here to fight the land anymore. Now he had to serve the people who lived on it. Tiva was waiting near the cooking stones. She handed him a folded piece of cloth, rough spun linen the same shade as the dust. "You wear this today," she said. Caleb looked down at the tunic, then back at her. "No rifle? No horse? Now no boots?" She raised an eyebrow. "Today you are not a scout. You are a man learning how to carry something besides a weapon." He nodded, slipped the shirt over his head, and followed her toward the heart of the village. That's when the work began. First came the wood. The elder women pointed to the edge of the forest, where bundles had to be chopped and hauled back. Caleb had swung axes before, but never like this, not with children watching, not with the pressure of a people's judgment sitting on his shoulders like a second yoke. Next came fence mending, patching broken joints, tightening rope lashings where the goats had gotten too curious, then hauling buckets from the well, digging a fresh pit for ashes behind the cooking stones. Every time he finished one task, another appeared. Tiva watched from a distance, never helping, never interfering, just watching. The people didn't speak to him at first, not really, but they didn't ignore him either. A young boy tossed him a water skin at midday. A woman pointed with her chin when he stacked the wood wrong. And once, when he stumbled under a load of kindling, an old man grunted from behind him, "Straighten your back, white eyes. We don't bow in this village." By dusk, Caleb's hands were bleeding. His arms throbbed, but something in his chest had shifted. No one called him outsider. Not once. That night, he sat by the fire with a bowl of stew in his lap. He ate in silence, surrounded by voices not meant for him, but not against him either. They didn't ask questions, but they didn't shoo him away. Tiva approached with slow, measured steps. She stood over him, silhouetted by firelight. "You did well." Caleb looked up. "That's it? No counsel? No verdict?" She sat across from him, arms resting on her knees. "You think this was about passing or failing?" "I thought everything was." Tiva shook her head. "This was about showing who you are when no one claps for you. No badge, no command, just your hands and what you choose to do with them." He leaned back against a post, eyes half shut. "Then I hope I chose right." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not done yet." "Figured. The council will speak tomorrow," she said, "but not just about your work. They will ask you to make your choice." Caleb frowned. "I thought this was the choice." "No," she said softly. "This was the proof. Now comes the decision. You've lived like us. But tomorrow, they'll ask if you'll stay like us. Not just for me, for everything." He didn't answer right away. The fire cracked. Somewhere beyond the circle of light, coyotes sang into the dark. Tiva stood again. "Rest. Tomorrow you speak with the elders. No axe will help you then." As she turned to go, Caleb called after her. "Tiva." She paused. "I didn't come here to stay." "I know. But the man who came here isn't the one who'll answer tomorrow." A pause. Then, quietly, almost like a breath, "I hope not." They didn't send him off with blessings. No chants, no tokens. Just a single nod from Taza, and the quiet scrape of Manga's drawing a line in the sand with his staff. "You cross back before sundown on the third day," the elder said, eyes like dried stone. "If the land hasn't eaten you, we'll listen to what's left of your voice." Caleb stood at the edge of the village, with nothing but a water skin, a flint, and the clothes on his back. No weapon, no food, no compass, just the brutal openness of the high desert stretching ahead, sun rising over it like a hammer. Tiva was there. She didn't say goodbye, but she handed him a square of leather, scrap from the hem of her sash, worn soft from years of wind and work. "For luck," she muttered. He tucked it in his belt and stepped across the line. The heat came quick. By midday, it was a living thing, pressing on his back, crawling down his throat, clawing at the inside of his skull. The land was a patchwork of rock and bone, the sky a sheet of white fire. Sweat dried faster than it formed. His boots scuffed the dust, raising ghosts with every step. He walked for hours, then longer. Time didn't move in straight lines anymore. There was no trail, no sign, only instinct, and that deep, buried compass inside him that had never failed before. But out here, even that faltered. He found shade beneath a ledge on the second night. It wasn't rest, just survival. He curled against the stone, muscles twitching, tongue thick in his mouth. Stars blinked overhead, indifferent. That's when the fever came. Visions, whispers, shapes moving just beyond the edge of his sight. He saw the face of his father, weathered and silent. He saw blood on the dirt, a girl's cry swallowed by the wind, and through it all, Tiva's eyes, steady, fierce, waiting. "What are you doing out here, soldier boy?" The voice wasn't real, but it cut deeper than thirst. He pushed on. By dawn of the third day, Caleb was a husk. Lips split, skin blistered, but his legs moved. One foot, then the next, then again. He climbed a ridge, lungs burning. On the other side, the village lay in the distance, small, nestled against the red earth, a mirage of smoke and movement. His vision tunneled, the sun roared, and then he fell. Not down the ridge, not off a cliff, just fell inward, like his body folded on itself. He didn't know how long he laid there, minutes, hours, maybe a lifetime. But something brought him back, a smell, smoke and cedar. A voice, soft, low, but insistent. He opened his eyes. A boy stood over him, one of the children from the village. Not old enough to speak more than a few words. But the boy had his hand out, palm up, waiting. Caleb blinked. Took it. The child didn't pull. Just stood there, a bridge between the dying wild and the home beyond it. Caleb rose, staggered the last stretch. When he crossed the line into the village again, the crowd didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They just watched. Silent. Heavy. But something was different in their eyes now. Recognition. Mangas stepped forward, gaze sweeping over Caleb's broken frame. "The desert burns what doesn't belong," he said. "You came back. That means something." Caleb said nothing. His voice was gone. But his legs held. And that was enough. The desert had chewed him up and spit him back hollow. But Caleb didn't get to rest. Before the sun could even climb above the cliffs the next morning, Mangas barked his command. "No more proving yourself to the land. Now you prove yourself to the people." Caleb didn't ask what that meant. He just followed. What came next wasn't a fight or a feat. It was a grind. Day one started with silence. No one greeted him. No one offered water or welcome. He was handed a rope and pointed toward a pile of firewood half the size of a wagon. The elders had spoken. He was to haul it, piece by piece, from the clearing to the cook fires. Alone. No mule, no cart, just his blistered hands and legs still shaky from the trial. By mid-morning the sun bore down again. It wasn't the searing furnace of the open desert, but it pressed just the same, especially with every trip. His back screamed, his arms trembled, but he didn't stop. Not even when he passed by the same children laughing under shade. Not even when he saw Tiva mending a blanket in the distance, her eyes flickering toward him but giving nothing away. Come sundown, he collapsed outside the longhouse, soaked through in his own sweat. He thought it was over. It wasn't. Day two broke with harder lessons. A gruff voice shook him awake. "Taza." "Come," the old man said. "You will learn how we eat." That meant helping dig irrigation trenches with boys half his size and twice his speed. It meant scraping cornmeal until his hands bled. It meant kneeling beside women he barely knew, grinding seeds while their eyes watched, sharp as flint, waiting for him to quit. But Caleb didn't. He didn't speak unless spoken to. didn't flinch when scolded, didn't raise his voice when a child spilled a pot he'd been carrying for an hour. He just cleaned it up. And something changed, not all at once, but slowly. One of the boys tossed him a dry strip of deer jerky during the midday break. One of the older women offered him a drink without words. When the evening came, he was no longer shooed away from the fire. He sat a little closer. Tiva approached before the flames, a clay bowl in her hands. She crouched beside him, offering it without ceremony. Stewed beans, warm, earthy. He accepted with a nod. "You're not weak," she said quietly, eyes scanning his face. "But strength is not rare out here. It's humility that we watch for." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was finally being understood. That night, the village didn't celebrate, but they didn't ignore him either. A space had been cleared, not just by sweat and labor, but by something deeper, a willingness to listen, to carry what others carry, not as penance, but as offering. Caleb lay on a woven mat by the outer fire, watching sparks chase stars. He hadn't earned their love, not yet. But maybe he was starting to earn something better. Respect, not just from Tiva or Mangas or the ones who judged from afar, but from himself. For the first time since stepping onto Apache soil, he didn't feel like a trespasser. He felt like someone being weighed, and maybe, just maybe, coming up a little less short. By the third night, the fires in Caleb's limbs had dulled, but a new ache had taken root deeper in his bones. He'd faced the land. He'd labored among the people. But now, as he stood before the council fire once more, there was nothing left to do, only something to decide. The whole village had gathered. Quiet. Still. The kind of stillness that presses on your chest like the air before a storm. Tiva stood across from him, her gaze unreadable, shoulders squared like she bore 1,000 years of tradition on her back. Beside her was Nijoni, aged and ageless, eyes sharp as obsidian, and towering beside her, Mangas, arms crossed, face carved in stone. Caleb's boots felt heavy in the dirt. Mangas finally spoke, voice low and steady, like thunder rolling through a canyon. "There is no final task, no beast to wrestle, no mountain to climb." The elder paused, letting the silence speak. "You've walked our land, bled for our work, seen our lives with your own eyes. Now you must answer one thing." He took a step forward, and the flames lit the deep lines in his face. "Will you stay? Not for duty, not for fear, but for her, for us, for all of it." Caleb's jaw clenched. His heart pounded like war drums beneath his ribs. He looked at Tiva, and time slowed. He remembered the first moment he saw her, wild, elemental, eyes fierce with fire and pride. He remembered her voice, the way it cut like flint when she named his trespass. He remembered her silence, too, the kind that carried weight, not absence. And he remembered the way she'd offered him that bowl of beans, not with pity, but with earned respect. He turned his eyes to the faces around him, the elders, the children, the women by the looms, the boys by the horses. He had never belonged anywhere, not really. The army gave him a title, not a home. Maps gave him roots, not roots. But here he had been tested, not for how well he followed orders, but for how deeply he could give himself. And now they were asking for nothing but truth. No lies, no half measures. Caleb looked back at Mangas, and he spoke. "Before I came here, I thought a man earned his place by what he conquered. Land, enemies, distance." His voice cracked, dry and hoarse. "But I was wrong. A man's place, It ain't claimed by taking. It's given, when he's willing to give himself. He turned to Tiva. If you'll have me, not by law, not by pressure, but by heart, then yes, I choose you. I choose this. The fire popped. A breath passed, then another, and slowly, first from Taza, then from Nijoni, came the nods. Small, measured, but final. It was done. The final trial had never been about survival. It had been about surrender, not to weakness, but to truth. And Caleb had passed, not with fists, but with his soul laid bare. The morning after the fire ceremony came soft and golden, like the land itself had exhaled. A slow wind stirred the dust, whispering through the cottonwoods that lined the edge of the village. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out once, and then vanished into silence. Caleb rose before the sun, just as he always had. Only this time, there was no uniform to put on, no orders waiting, no boots by a military tent flap, just the cool ground beneath his feet, the scent of mesquite smoke lingering from last night's flames, and the sound of a village waking around him. Not in alarm, but in peace. He stepped outside and found Tiva sitting on a low rock, her long black hair catching the morning light like polished obsidian. She didn't turn when she heard him. She just said softly, "It is done." He sat beside her. "I thought I'd feel different," he said, "like I'd crossed some line and suddenly turned into someone new." Tiva finally looked at him, her dark eyes calm but unyielding. "You didn't cross a line," she said. "You came home." He didn't reply. Not right away. Words didn't come easy in moments like this. The army had trained him to survive, to scout, to shoot. But it hadn't taught him what to do with peace. So he watched the village instead. Watched the young ones chasing a half-flat ball near the edge of the huts. Watched old Mangas nod respectfully as he passed by, the faintest trace of a smile under his weathered mustache. Watched Nijoni speak to a cluster of women as they began sorting beans under the shade. And for the first time, he didn't feel like an observer. He wasn't outside the circle anymore. He was part of it. Later that day, they bound his hands to Tiva's in front of the people. Not with rope, but with woven strands of river grass and turquoise thread. It wasn't loud. It wasn't grand. It was sacred. And that made it enough. That night, around the embers of a quieter fire, Caleb took a breath and asked Tiva, "Why did you choose to honor that law? Why not let me walk away after what I did?" She didn't answer right away. She picked up a small stone and rubbed it between her fingers. "Because I saw you," she said. "Not just the mistake. I saw your shame, your stillness. You didn't run. You didn't shout. You listened." She looked up. "You saw me, and you stayed." Caleb blinked, his throat tight. There were no more trials now, no more proving. Just living. He didn't know what the future would bring. This wasn't the kind of story that ended with riches or rank. The land was still harsh. The world beyond still cruel. But here, under the stars, next to the woman who had once called him a ghost in her world, Caleb Tanner finally felt real. And sometimes, that's all a man needs. Final reflection and call to action. Out here in the West, redemption doesn't come easy. But sometimes it ain't about erasing the past. It's about choosing the future, one step at a time. Would you have made the same choice as Caleb? Could you walk away from the life you knew? For love, for truth, for something greater than yourself? Subscribe now to hear more stories that ride the line between heart and frontier.